Well, good morning. Perhaps not the cheeriest of topics that you'll hear at Casual Connect, but I think quite an important one. Because we would not have to go back very far in time before it would be unthinkable, I think, that people would pay real money for virtual things that have no marginal cost of production, no delivery costs, virtually, no stock issues, and which is incredibly big business. And when I say not very far back in time, I would think within the lifetime of everyone here. It's an amazing business, as we all know. But when you get very big business, as Chris says, then you get interest from politicians, and eventually you get interest from regulators. And that's particularly so once the media pick up on it. So this young chap, I think he was 11 years old at the time, was playing zombies versus ninjas, and in the space of 15 minutes ran up nearly £2,000 on his parents' credit card bill. And that might have gone unnoticed by anyone other than his parents, were it not for the fact that he appeared in the Daily Mail, which is one of the very widely circulated newspapers in the UK, and got a huge amount of press about it. And he wasn't the only one, of course. There have been other examples. So it was perhaps inevitable that the UK's consumer regulatory body, the Office of Fair Trading, would start to look into this whole, for them, entirely new area of in-app purchases. So very simple summary of where we are, how we got here. It was back in April last year that the OFT announced that it would be investigating children's web and app-based games. Then in September last year, it published an initial report with some draft principles, 8 draft principles that it felt reflected current legislation. And then it opened up a consultation period for anyone who was interested to throw in their 2 pennyworth and make observations on their report or the draft principles. And then very recently, at the end of January, it published its final report and principles. And it said, okay, guys, you've got until the 1st of April 2014 to get your house in order. And after that, we're going to start potentially coming after people who we believe are not in compliance. Now, just to be clear, what the consumer regulator is doing is not imposing, in its view, new law. It is simply trying to interpret law that already exists. And this is not just UK law, it is essentially pan-EU law. So the regulator is saying, this is how we think this existing law applies to the world of in-app purchases in apps and online games. It's not, if you like, definitive, it's their view, but when a regulator expresses a view, then it's wise to at least pay attention to their view. I want to pick out some key findings in their original report because this will help you understand, I think, where they're coming from and the principles that they have espoused. So the OFT said, we've looked at 38 games that are likely to appeal to children. They've not disclosed which games they've looked at, although I think a few are fairly easy to guess. These are not just games that were published by UK publishers. These are games made available to consumers in the UK, and so included games from, if you like, non-UK and indeed from Far Eastern publishers. And they said that across all of those games, every single one of them had at least one, what they call commercial practice that it considered to be unfair. And some of them had multiple practices it considered to be unfair. It said that some are unfair and aggressive commercial practices. So things like implying that a player, particularly a child, would somehow be letting a friend or a teammate down if they didn't buy something in that game, putting people under a level of duress, if you like, to make a purchase for real money. And also it said there's a complete lack of transparency in the information provided and what you're actually doing within games. And when you're buying things for real money, or when you're buying things for virtual money. And that distinction's blurred, and that's particularly important in their mind, understandably, when you're dealing with children who don't necessarily recognize the difference between a virtual coin and a real money purchase. So they're being, if you like, exploitative of children, the OFT said, and not just children, though. This is something that could apply to everyone. So on the back of those key findings, the OFT published their 8 principles. The first 3 principles are all to do with information which it believes publishers should be providing to people who download these games or play these games. So principle 1, you have to provide information about costs up front. Principle 2, material information should be provided up front. And principle 3, information about who you are and where to go as a consumer if you have a complaint or a query. Now, what the OFT's done, and I'll say it at the end, but I'll mention it now, it's well worth looking at their report. It's not very long. It's incredibly user-friendly, at least in terms of what it means, even if you don't like what it says. And what the OFT have done is not just express the principles, but they've given a whole load of examples to try to make clear what they mean by those principles. So, for example, for principle 1, information about costs being provided up front, it gives in its examples of things it thinks are less likely to comply and those which it thinks are more likely to comply. The OFT is not a court, it's just giving a view, but it's trying to, in its mind, help as far as possible. So, for example, if you have a game that's free to download, it says, then you play the game, you're up to level 10 or something, and in their example, the game's based on finding hidden fairies in a forest, advertised for free. You get to level 10, then suddenly you find out as a consumer, to get to level 11, you've got to pay 69 pence. And you never knew that right back at the start. There was nothing at the beginning of the game that said there are in-app purchases. To complete this game or to progress, you're going to have to spend some money. And if you do that, then the OFT says, well, we think you're not giving sufficient information. So the next 2 principles was about being clear on in-game messaging. So you've got to be clear about what the game is saying by way of promotions, and you have to be clear about distinctions, if you like, within the gameplay of the game and promotions that deal with spending real money. For example, it says, if a game says, buy a puppy, and when you buy the puppy it's for virtual money that you don't have to buy, but then it says, buy extra bones, and before you know it, you're spending real money on extra bones for your free puppy, without really a child being able to make the distinction between buying the puppy for virtual currency and buying the bones for real money. Principles 6 and 7, it says, no aggressive practices. This is wording taken straight from consumer legislation. So anything that sort of preys upon a child's, what it says, inherent inexperience, vulnerability or credulity, or makes a direct exhortation to children, again that's language taken straight from consumer legislation, then that, in their view, is likely to fall foul of consumer legislation. So, for example, for principle 6, a game involving a seagull. If your game says, your seagull is hungry, feed him ice cream or he will be unhappy. And to buy the ice cream, you've got to spend real money. So the poor, distraught child is desperate to spend some money to feed poor little seagull before the seagull gets unhappy. So it's that kind of thing that the OFT says. If you're dealing with children, you shouldn't be doing that. And finally, provide informed consent before any payment is made. And you don't have to go back many years in conferences like this, and you have sessions like the golden 15 minutes, the 15 minutes when the child gets the iPad off the parents unlock the code, you've got to get as much money as possible out of that child within the next 15 minutes. And I've been to talks like that, and you can sort of see the thinking behind it. But the OFT is saying, you can't do that. You've got to be absolutely clear to both parent and child what's involved in these things. So there are the OFT's 8 principles. Now, you may be sitting there thinking, so the OFT, this is a UK games regulator, this is a global business. What does a national regulator say that's going to really make a difference beyond the borders of one particular territory? Well, yes, the OFT only has jurisdiction for games made available to consumers in the UK, although, of course, that's not just people based in the UK. I think the UFT would struggle taking action against someone who is entirely based overseas, but theoretically they could. However, the legislation they're talking about is pan-EU legislation. So the same legislation that they're looking at basically applies right across the EU countries. The UFT were slightly prickly about this point when people raised it with them and said, well, we may just be the UK regulator, but we've got all our mates across the globe. And I didn't know this, but once a year they all get together in places like this, you know, or the OFT and the Japanese trade regulator and the Russians and the Americans, and they sit down for a week together and go out for, you know, drinks afterwards and exchange stories about bad practices that they found in their countries. And they had their meeting, I think, back in the autumn of last year, and you can be under no doubt the OFT was saying, look what we found. There are these things called in-app purchases. They're evil. Well, that's probably overstating the case. But there's an issue here, guys. We've made a big investigation into this, and we will provide you free of charge our report, our principles, and they've made no secret is they are encouraging their counterparties in other territories to follow the same basic approach because they think it's a good approach. And there are suggestions that that is being done because, to my knowledge, it is the only consumer regulator who've really investigated this market in any degree of detail. In the meantime, of course, as you'll be aware, the German consumer regulator has taken its own steps, which I'll come on to in a moment. And then more recently, of course, the FTC and Apple have had a little conversation where Apple, at the goodness of their heart, have agreed to pay $32.5 million back to people who've bought in-app stuff when they didn't apparently intend to do so. I mentioned Germany because in parallel with the OFT's investigation, the consumer regulator in Germany, they don't mess around with reports and investigations and consultations. They just take some action against someone. And the unfortunate person in the line of their sites were Gameforge and their game Runes of Magic. And Gameforge put out an advert for Runes of Magic saying, seize the advantageous opportunity and add that certain something to your armor and weapons. And on it went. And there was a direct link to a shop where you could buy said armor and weapons. And the court in Germany said, no, you can't do that. That is a direct exhortation to children, that language again, taken direct from consumer legislation in the EU. And you, Gameforge, are in breach of that. And they pointed to various things in the language of the advert that made it clear in their view that the advert was being pointed to children. And the decision, or the reasons for that decision have recently been published. They are as clear as mud. It's total confusion as to what the German regulator really thinks about this, or what the court thinks about their view of this, I should say. So against that backdrop, the OFT's approach looks actually quite user-friendly, because at least it's tried to, A, provide you with a chance to say something, and B, set out its views of life more generally, and give a chance to actually get people to let the house in order before they take any legal action against you. Again, it's not just individual regulators, but the European Commission is looking at this as well. The European Commission has these things called sweeps. It's not clean the sort of steps of the place at Brussels or Strasbourg. It's they pick on an area of the market and they do an investigation, a sort of analysis of the market, and they say, what's happening here? And they picked on freemium. They'd heard about this thing called freemium. They said, there's this thing out here where games are advertised for free, but at a later stage, you buy stuff in the games. It's amazing, but it happens. And so the European Commission has started looking at that. They put out this press release that I've quoted here on the slide. And they said, we're going to have to look at this because we think consumers need to get better information to make sure they don't run up disproportionate charges. So exactly the thing that the OFT has been looking at, exactly the thing that the German court has been looking at, now the Commission is looking at. It will be interesting to see to what extent the Commission pick up on the OFT's report and, if you like, piggyback on that, as opposed to sort of doing their own thing. But I think it's likely that they're going to come up with something not dissimilar to the OFT's position. So, as I say, it's not just a UK thing, it's not just a purely national thing, it's not just an EU thing, because we've seen the FTC looking at this, and there are other consumer regulators. As an aside, the OFT's report has a list of the people who made representations to their draft report and principles, And that includes consumer bodies from places like Norway and Japan and other territories. So other people are looking at this. So that's consumer legislation. So there's this is all existing law, but consumer regulators are looking at this sector. I couldn't, however, sort of give a talk on regulation without just mentioning privacy, because, as you know, it's a huge issue generally, and for apps in particular. There's this group called Working Party 29, which is a group of national regulators in the EU who get together. They put out a paper on data protection guidance about mobile apps. They said they're concerned that publishers are taking more data than is really needed, and they're concerned there's a lack of transparency in why data is being collected. The ICO is the national regulator, privacy regulator in the UK. It's also put out guidance for developers. Again, well worth a look, because the principles they espouse, you could say, are very similar to the principles that you'd have to comply with for people like copper, or the Californian sort of special version of copper. Gambling. A lot of apps involve gambling, but not involving real money. And if you like, the ability or lack of ability to translate winnings into real money has been, if you like, the wall that's holding back a dam of regulation to a whole load of apps. That wall arguably is crumbling slightly, and in some countries, particularly say Belgium, there's this increasing suggestion that even gambling for virtual money could fall within some of the gambling legislation. So I think that's another area to watch in terms of regulation. When we think about the regulators are not just the regulators like the OFT or the European Commission or whoever. They become the platform owners. Because, of course, when you publish an app on any platform, you have to accept some SDK, other terms and conditions, and they will put the burden, or try to put the burden of compliance on you. You confirm that your app complies with all legislation and regulations everywhere in the globe. And if there's a problem, then as between you and the platform owner, it's your problem. But also, platform owners have become policemen as well. And that's because they realize that their position, if you like, of washing their hands and saying it's all the publisher's problem is not sustainable in the eyes of the regulators. And one of the big areas of representation that was made to the OFT in response to its draft report was, well, hang on, you're telling us to provide all this information, you're telling us to do this and do that, but we're having to work within a very sort of narrow and prescribed channel that is put to us by the platform owners such as Apple. And the OFT have taken that point on board, and in their final report, they have said, okay, so for things like the principles 1, 2, and 3, the provision of information, the platform owners have the obligation to enable the publishers to comply with those principles. So if you can't comply with those principles because the Apple ecosystem doesn't let you, then that becomes Apple's problem. And of course, Apple have sort of woken up to this, and they've put a children's area on the App Store. There's increasing limitations within certain categories of activities, such as real money gaming. So I think we'll see platform owners becoming possibly slightly more, I was going to say discerning, that's probably not the best word, but slightly more picky about which apps go up, because they don't want to be in the line of fire of regulators when someone complains about an app. And of course, regulators are, in a sense, the game players. If you're doing crazy stuff in apps, then you're going to get a response from the game playing community that's not going to be very helpful, along with the wider public. I mean, we all know that PR like this sort of chap in the Daily Mail is not particularly helpful. So just in closing, just looking at the future, I think there will be increasing pressure from consumer protection law, not new law, existing law, but being translated into this new world, and therefore increasing pressure perhaps from regulators. Slightly different point, but I want to make it, is for a number of years there's been a lot of academic debate about the whole issue of title to virtual goods. Who owns virtual goods? Can you own these special swords you've bought, et cetera, et cetera. And there have been some sort of interesting arguments about that, particularly in the US. Consumer law now recognizes a whole new category of goods called digital goods. Consumer law traditionally has only ever known goods and services, and it's applied laws to the provision of goods and services. It's woken up to the fact that this stuff called digital goods, which is like packets of data supplied in a form such as an app or music, sort of has some characteristics of goods and some characteristics of service. So in consumer legislation now we have this new category of digital goods, and I think that's a step towards giving virtual goods an increasing ability, if you like, to have a life of its own. And the approach traditionally and today is we try to capture virtual goods within, if you like, a EULA. And we say they're not really goods. All you're getting is a limited, revocable license, etc., to use this stuff. And if we happen not to produce this game anymore, you lose it. You can't transfer it, you can't buy it, you can't sell it other than within certain prescriptive ways. So it's all, if you like, a contractual right within a EULA. It doesn't have its own property right. And actually there's been some recent case law in Germany which has helped that argument. You may have seen as a really important case recently involving Steam, where the German Consumer Authority was going after Steam saying, you cannot prohibit the transfer of game accounts. You must allow consumers to transfer their game accounts. It's all based on the concept of exhaustion of rights, and the consumer organisation lost that, so it helps the argument that, if you like, EULAs and virtual goods are contractual rights. I think that will become, over time, increasingly difficult to sustain. So in closing, just a few action points. I would thoroughly recommend you have a look at the UFT's report. Very easy to read, very simple, and it's worth just reflecting on what they say. Be particularly careful if your game is, quote, likely to appeal to children. That is a topic in itself. The UFT said, in their view, a child is probably anyone under 16. In Germany, probably anyone under 14, but it could be anyone between 12 and 18, depending on your view of life. Always think about privacy, of course. And probably the single bit of advice to take away is always ask yourself, what is fair and reasonable? Which may seem like really odd advice coming from a lawyer, but if you were to distill consumer legislation across the globe into a single sentence, that is it. You can't legislate consumer law away in a EULA or contract terms or privacy policy. Fairness and reasonableness will always trump you on that. If you think that your practice is unfair or unreasonable, then it's likely that a regulator is going to take the same view. That was all I was going to say. Thank you very much for your attention.